Everyone thought I was just the quiet wife, Emily Clark, married to the respected analyst Mark Clark. It's strange how easily a life can be constructed out of silence. When you nod at the right moments, smile when expected, and never interrupt the rhythm of a room, people don't just overlook you, they erase you entirely. I leaned into that erasure. From the outside, I was everything Mark needed me to be: accommodating, undemanding, loyal, the kind of woman who quietly refilled wine glasses during his dinner parties, who kept her legs crossed and her thoughts tucked away. I rarely made eye contact with his colleagues. I didn't correct him when he misstated details about my past, or invented them. And when he laughed at my expense in front of others, I laughed too. Softly. Just enough. That too was part of the job. We met, predictably, in D.C. He was already ascending in the intelligence community, a consultant for high-clearance analytics contracts, frequently quoted in industry white papers, occasionally invited to closed-door panels, handsome in a sharp-edged kind of way, the sort of man who rehearses sincerity in the mirror until it looks effortless. I was introduced to him at a holiday function hosted by a mutual connection. He saw me as a prize. I saw him as a target. He liked women who didn't challenge him. I became that woman. The courtship was swift. He was charming in the way powerful men often are, selective with attention, possessive with his time. But I knew what was behind the curtain. I'd seen the patterns before, how he tested boundaries, gathered leverage, and extracted loyalty like a resource. He wanted devotion, not intimacy, control, not partnership. Perfect. He proposed after 8 months. By then, I'd already memorized the layout of his apartment, mapped the pattern of his calls, and installed a low-profile surveillance system masked as a high-end security upgrade. A wedding gift, I told him. He smiled. He said I was clever. He had no idea. I didn't wear a wire on our wedding day. Some moments deserve silence, even in operations. I needed to commit fully to the role. That day, I wore a lace-sleeved dress and carried pale roses, my fingers trembling not with nerves, but with the weight of what I was about to begin. Undercover assignments are rarely glamorous. You don't leap between rooftops or decrypt satellite feeds in real time. The real work is in the waiting, in listening, in the 1,000 invisible compromises you make every day to keep your mask in place, in letting yourself become small. I became small for 7 years. I learned the way Mark's voice changed when he was lying, how it grew slower, more measured, as if he were narrating rather than speaking. I learned that he kept a secondary phone hidden in the hollowed-out panel beneath his desk drawer, and that he never used it in our house. I learned that he had a network, not official colleagues, but discreet handlers, intermediaries, aliases that cropped up only in the corners of encrypted chat logs. Most importantly, I learned that he wasn't just bending rules. He was breaking them, systematically, repeatedly, for profit. That was the real reason I was there. Mark had been flagged long before I met him. Suspicion of unauthorized financial activity, subtle patterns of information leakage, connections to compromised foreign assets. But he was too careful for the usual probes. Traditional surveillance bounced off him like water on glass. He needed a shadow. That was me. Every dinner party we hosted was logged. Every offhand comment he made after a few bourbons was transcribed. Every time he left town, I searched, scanned, copied. I built timelines, cross-referenced data trails, tracked his behavior across months, then years. He believed I was dutiful. In reality, I was documenting the anatomy of betrayal. But there was a cost. You don't live beside someone for that long without the lines blurring. Not love, that was never the risk. But proximity has a weight. It seeps in. I knew how he liked his coffee, what jokes made him laugh, which cologne he wore when he wanted to be taken seriously. I was there when his mother died. I held his hand. He cried once, only once, and it was in the dark, curled toward the far side of our bed. He never spoke of it. Neither did I. That's the thing about deep cover. You give up your real reactions, your real self. You become the mirror of the person you're watching until the mission ends, or you forget where the reflection ends and you begin. 7 years is a long time to live in a role. But it ended on a crisp morning in Denver. The federal courthouse was an unassuming structure. Beige stone, metal detectors, cold light. I'd been here before, of course, in briefings and meetings behind closed doors, but never like this. Not standing beside Mark as the prosecution read the charges aloud. He looked composed, maybe even smug. He believed he was the one who had pulled the strings, that he'd cleverly diverted attention from himself by feeding investigators half-truths and manufactured leads. He thought the hearing would be a formality, a show. His voice was smooth when he shook hands with his lawyer. He didn't glance at me once. That was about to change. When the prosecutor asked me to take the stand, Mark barely reacted. He didn't know I was listed as a witness. That should have tipped him off. I walked past him. Our eyes met for less than a second. Just enough. I swore the oath, sat down, waited. Please state your name for the record. I leaned toward the mic. My name is Emily Clark. I paused. Then, I hold an active security clearance with the Department of Justice. I've been working undercover for the past 7 years. A ripple passed through the courtroom, barely audible, but palpable. A kind of collective stillness, like air being sucked from the room. I didn't look at Mark, but I didn't need to. I could feel his posture stiffen behind me. Shock has a sound. It's not loud. It's the absence of everything else. The prosecutor resumed, her voice steady now that the gauntlet had been thrown. She asked about my assignment, my cover, my timeline. I answered each question with precision. I spoke of intelligence-gathering operations and internal surveillance protocols. I used words like exfiltration, data retention, compromised assets. Each one chipped away at the identity Mark thought he controlled. When I submitted the first set of documents, printouts of wire transfers, encrypted message logs, voice recordings tagged with timestamps, I saw him lean forward for the first time. He tried to make eye contact. I didn't oblige. He opened his mouth as if to say something, closed it again. The illusion was unraveling, thread by thread. He wasn't the investigator. He was the target. And I wasn't the quiet wife anymore. The courtroom felt smaller now, as if my words had folded the walls inward, trapping us in a space where lies had nowhere left to hide. Every time I answered a question, it was like laying a brick, a foundation being built from the rubble of Mark's illusions. His lawyer kept glancing toward the defense table, trying to gauge how much damage had been done, but he hadn't seen the rest yet. He hadn't seen everything I had prepared. Mark still hadn't spoken. He didn't interrupt, didn't protest. His silence was telling. For years, he'd operated like a man who believed he was untouchable. Now, he was calculating, trying to figure out how long I had known, how deep I had gone, and most importantly, what I hadn't said yet. That terrified him more than anything. Please describe the origin of your investigation, the prosecutor prompted. I nodded. Initial concern was raised after several irregularities in contractor security clearances were flagged within a 6-month window. Multiple internal analysts suspected access credentials were being duplicated or spoofed. It was determined that the leak had to be coming from someone with deep institutional knowledge and indirect clearance-level access to segmented intelligence briefings. I paused just long enough to let the implications land. Mark Clark matched every profile filter. The agency couldn't risk alerting him. That's when I was assigned. The prosecutor stepped forward, her tone careful. To clarify for the court, you were embedded with the subject personally. As his spouse? Yes. A quiet murmur moved through the gallery. Journalists scribbled faster. I heard a camera shutter from behind the glass. Someone swore under their breath. Mark flinched. I could feel his ego tearing fiber by fiber as I spoke. He had used me as a prop, a backdrop to his performative normalcy. It was a long-standing pattern in his life. Everything had to orbit him. He never noticed when someone refused to spin. For 7 years, I let him underestimate me. Did your husband ever suspect you were investigating him? I shook my head. No, he suspected everyone else. That got a few quiet laughs, even from the jury. But I wasn't joking. Mark's paranoia had always been dressed up as control. Double-checking encrypted lines, changing burner devices monthly, refusing to save any passwords digitally. He prided himself on running a clean operation, but even the most careful criminals have blind spots. His was me. The prosecutor continued. What was the first piece of hard evidence you gathered? I reached for the binder beside me and opened it with precision. I'd prepared this moment for years. This, I said, holding up a printed screenshot, is an export of an internal chat log retrieved from a custom server Mark kept on an external drive labeled Tax Returns. In it, he corresponds with an intermediary using an encrypted nickname, Echo 9. The logs correlate to data leaks that match timestamps of intelligence reports released on the black market exactly 48 hours after he accessed them. The judge asked for copies to be distributed. The defense objected, overruled. Mark was visibly sweating now. I also have metadata showing drive activity, I added, along with timestamps of when the files were opened, copied, and subsequently wiped using a secure deletion tool. What Mark didn't realize is that the tool left residual activity markers. I recovered those too. Is this evidence you collected while undercover as his spouse? Yes. A beat. And he consented to the surveillance, knowingly or unknowingly? Yes. The home security system I installed was capable of dual-channel recording. I disclosed it on the lease agreement, which he signed. He just didn't read the fine print. The prosecutor almost smiled. Would you say Mark Clark took sufficient precautions to avoid detection? I considered the question. No. He took just enough to appear clean on the surface, but his arrogance was louder than his paranoia. I could see Mark bristling at that. His jaw tightened. That's what finally got to him. Not the data, not the charges, not the exposure, but the implication that he wasn't good at it, that he had been bested, outplayed, watched by the very woman he kissed goodnight. He turned to whisper to his attorney, who waved him off and leaned toward the judge instead. They requested a recess. Denied. I resumed. I also have recordings, I said. Some audio, some video, all gathered legally under my operational authority. These include confidential conversations between Mark and 2 known data brokers operating out of Prague and Bucharest, both of whom were indicted last year in connected cases. He used a relay server to obfuscate origin points, but I traced the digital fingerprints. I submitted the transcripts. The courtroom was silent except for the sounds of pages turning and keys clicking. I didn't glance at Mark. He wasn't my husband anymore. He hadn't been for a long time. Not since the night I caught him on a call at 2 a.m., telling someone he could deliver the full architecture diagram if the price was right. I remembered standing in the hallway barefoot, hearing that single phrase through the cracked door of his study. That was the moment the line between cover and conviction disappeared for me. That was the moment I decided to take him down personally. When the prosecutor finished with me, I knew what was coming next. It was the defense attorney's turn. He stood slowly, tall, precise, clean-cut. He walked toward me like a man approaching a podium he'd stood at 100 times. He looked at the jury, then at me. "Mrs. Clark," he said. Or Agent Clark now, I suppose. He let that hang in the air, trying to plant suspicion, undermine. Do you have any emotional stake in this case? Define emotional. Did your marriage suffer during this long investigation? We didn't have a marriage. We had a contract. He raised an eyebrow. Interesting. And you feel your testimony today is unaffected by any personal resentment you may harbor toward Mr. Clark? That was the line they'd chosen. Paint me as a bitter wife. I leaned forward slightly, keeping my tone even. No, counselor, My testimony is not based on resentment. It is based on verified evidence, authenticated logs, and chain of custody files. But since you bring it up, I'll go ahead and disclose something to avoid further confusion. I reached for my credentials, tucked neatly in a folder beside the transcripts. I held them up, flipping to the official page. I am a federal agent currently assigned to the Internal Integrity Task Force. My identity and clearance level have been verified by both the Department of Justice and the Office of the Inspector General. This operation was sanctioned, supervised, and regularly audited. I handed the documents to the bailiff, who passed them to the judge. The defense lawyer's face froze for a fraction of a second. That's when he knew the narrative had slipped from his hands. My testimony, I said clearly, is not about emotion. It's about facts. And those facts place Mark Clark at the center of a deliberate, repeated pattern of federal crimes, including unauthorized dissemination of classified materials, use of foreign intermediaries for personal gain, and obstruction of investigative processes. Another pause, including the very investigation he claimed to be leading. That hit like a hammer, because that was the final turn, the last trick. Mark hadn't just committed crimes. He had positioned himself as the lead analyst on the task force investigating those crimes. He was feeding misinformation to his own team, creating a hall of mirrors to slow down the truth. He framed others, misled auditors, altered logs, all while the real evidence was being collected under his nose, in his home, by his wife. The jury was wrapped. The judge called for a break. As I stepped down from the stand, I passed Mark. He didn't look at me this time. Not fully. Just a flicker of eye contact. A shadow of the man who once thought he owned the room and the woman in it. But he didn't own me. Not then. Not ever. I walked back to my seat with my spine straight, my hands steady, and the knowledge that the final piece of the case was now in play. The weapon hadn't been force or fear or confrontation. It had been silence. Silence that listened. Silence that waited. Silence that watched. After the break, everything changed. The judge returned to the bench with my credentials still in hand. He took a moment to review them again, his brow furrowed not with doubt, but with gravity. The kind of weight that comes when the room realizes this isn't just another fraud case. This is a betrayal wrapped in national interest. This is espionage with a wedding band. Let the record show, the judge said, voice steady, that the witness has submitted verification of her role as a federal agent embedded in a classified long-term operation. Credentials have been reviewed and accepted by the court. The testimony will stand. Mark leaned forward, both elbows on the table, hands laced together under his chin. It was the posture he used when he wanted to look composed, confident, in control. But his knuckles were white. The next witness was a forensic analyst from the DOJ, someone I'd worked with in silence for nearly half a decade. He took the stand and verified the chain of custody on the materials I'd collected. He confirmed the server logs, the data transfer paths, the security clearances bypassed with forged metadata. He outlined the shell corporations Mark had funneled payments through, including the one he named after a hiking trail we once visited in Utah. I almost laughed when I heard it. That's what Mark did. He hid his crimes behind sentiment. He used tokens from our shared life like camouflage, a numbered account that matched our anniversary, a burner phone registered with his late father's initials, a data packet labeled with the same string of characters we used for our Netflix password. It was his version of cleverness. He thought that if it felt personal, it wouldn't look criminal. But I had learned long ago, sentimentality is not the same as sincerity. The prosecution used my materials like scalpels, slicing through Mark's carefully cultivated image. Each document, each recording, each cross-reference transfer was a small dismantling. He was unraveling right there in front of the courtroom, and everyone could see it. Then they called the next witness. It was someone Mark did not expect. A man named Victor Nadek, Known in certain circles, flagged on multiple watch lists, suspected of acting as a go-between for compromised data handlers across Eastern Europe. He was escorted in under U.S. Marshal protection, face pale, suit too large. His eyes darted across the room and stopped cold when they found Mark. Mark's entire body stiffened. "Do you recognize the defendant?" the prosecutor asked. Victor nodded. "Yes, we met in Zurich. He gave me access keys." Mark's attorney shot to his feet with an objection so loud it startled the stenographer. The judge waved it off. Victor continued. "He said the files were scrubbed. Military-grade encryption. He asked for payment in Bitcoin split across 4 wallets. We communicated through a secure channel. I have screenshots." He paused, then added, "He was always careful, but he got greedy." Those last 4 words hit harder than the rest, because they were true. Mark's greatest vulnerability wasn't carelessness, it was pride. He didn't just want to sell information. He wanted to outmaneuver the very systems that trained him. He wanted to prove that he was smarter than the people who trusted him. That's why he insisted on leading the internal task force. That's why he set up mirrors within mirrors. That's why, in the end, I had to be the one to stop him. I didn't look away as Victor testified. I wanted Mark to feel the weight of every single person he had underestimated. Most of all, I wanted him to feel mine. When Victor stepped down, Mark's defense attorney requested an emergency recess. Denied. Again. The judge's tone had cooled considerably. "You've had ample time to prepare, counselor. The witness list was filed properly. We proceed." The next 2 hours moved like a slow-motion car crash. One witness after another chipped away at Mark's defense. A financial auditor from Geneva, a DOJ cyberpath analyst, a former intern of Mark's who had unknowingly filed clearance paperwork for a foreign national on Mark's orders. She cried on the stand when she realized what she'd been pulled into. And Mark? He didn't say a word. He just sat there, eyes dark, face expressionless, watching his empire collapse. But I wasn't done yet, because I had saved one last piece, something I hadn't told the prosecution about until the morning of the trial, something too dangerous to risk pre-trial, something personal, a recording. I had made it 3 years ago, late at night, while Mark was on the phone in his study. I had intercepted the call, not just recorded it, but captured the encrypted stream before it fully obfuscated. It took months to decode. But when I did, it became the clearest admission in the entire case. It wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about data. It was about betrayal. Not of me, but of the oath he took. He was trading defense intelligence, tactical assessments, war game simulations. He had tried to justify it in the recording, claiming it wasn't active field data, that it would never be missed, that everyone does it. But that night, he crossed a line even he couldn't disguise with his usual language of plausible deniability. He said, "It's just information, the kind I've been trusted with for years. I'm entitled to use it how I see fit." Entitled. That was the word that burned, because in the end, that's what all of this was about. Entitlement. Mark believed that access was ownership, that because the system trusted him, he owned its secrets, that because I stood beside him, I belonged to him, that because no one suspected him, he could never be guilty. He was wrong on all counts. When the prosecution played the recording, the room went completely still. Mark's voice filled the speakers, confident, dismissive, almost bored, like he was talking about the weather. When it ended, no one spoke. The silence this time wasn't suspense. It was certainty. The judge called for a recess. As people stood and filed out, I remained seated. Mark's lawyer leaned in close, whispering urgently. Mark didn't respond. For the first time, he looked older, smaller. The edge of his suit hung loose on his frame. He turned his head and met my eyes. It was a strange thing. That look. Not hate, not fear, not even rage. Just recognition. For the first time in 7 years, he saw me, really saw me. And in that moment, he understood that everything he thought he controlled had been illusion, that I had never been a passive observer, that I had been tracking every wire, every whisper, every lie, and waiting for the moment he handed me the last piece himself. When court resumed, the judge addressed the room without preamble. This court is now prepared to proceed to final testimony and closing arguments. It was moving faster now. The defense had no viable narrative left. They tried, weakly, to reframe my operation as entrapment, to question the legality of the embedded assignment. But my clearance, the DOJ's authorization letters, the recorded supervision logs, they all stood. Mark refused to testify in his own defense. Of course he did. He couldn't control the narrative anymore, so he withdrew from it. Cowardice disguised as restraint. He always knew how to cloak weakness in the illusion of strength. I watched as the defense rested their case. The prosecutor stood and gave a final statement that was short, precise, and devastating. She referenced the oath Mark had taken when he entered the intelligence community. She quoted it. And then she turned to the jury and said, he didn't just violate his oath, he commodified it. The jury didn't need theatrics. They had the truth. By the time we recessed for deliberation, the courtroom was already heavy with inevitability. Mark's fate had been sealed long before the closing arguments. He just hadn't known it. And now he did. I walked past him one last time on my way out. His eyes followed me. He opened his mouth, closed it again. There was nothing left to say. I didn't need to look back. I already knew how this story ended. The jury was out for less than 4 hours. For a case this complex, with evidence spanning years and international dimensions, that was lightning speed. But I wasn't surprised. They had heard everything. The forged credentials, the rerouted accounts, the intercepted communications, the voice of the man himself describing treason like it was a financial strategy. And they'd heard me, not just the facts I laid out, but the shape of the life I'd lived. A woman who'd served her country in silence, a wife who'd tracked her husband for 7 years, an agent whose cover had been marriage. When the bailiff called us back into the courtroom, I felt the shift in the air. It wasn't tension anymore. It was a kind of resignation, a breath held before the final page turned. I sat in the second row behind the prosecution now, no longer needed as a witness, but still a presence. Mark entered with his lawyer at his side. His suit was the same, but the posture had changed. Gone was the crisp, calculating composure. Now he walked like a man already weighed down by consequence. The judge asked for the verdict. The foreperson stood. In the matter of the United States versus Mark Daniel Clark, she read, on count 1, unauthorized dissemination of classified materials, we find the defendant guilty. On count 2, financial fraud and laundering through shell corporations, guilty. Count 3, obstruction of justice in a federal investigation, guilty. She continued through all 9 charges, guilty, guilty, guilty. Each word was a nail sealing shut a coffin Mark had built with his own hands. I watched him closely. No outburst, no plea, just silence. A strange kind of dignity, maybe, or maybe just the absence of anyone left to perform for. When the final count was read, the judge thanked the jury and scheduled sentencing for the following week. The defense made one last limp request for house arrest until then. Denied. Mark was remanded into custody immediately. As the marshals approached him, he turned, just slightly, and for the briefest moment looked back at me. There was no plea in that look, no rage, only the hollow recognition of a man who had finally, fully realized that the person sitting across from him wasn't the woman he thought she was. She never had been, and he would never know who she really was. I didn't flinch. I didn't nod. I didn't acknowledge him in any way, because the mission was over. I stayed in Denver for 3 days after the verdict. Technically, I was debriefed and cleared to leave within 24 hours, but leaving immediately would have felt like denial, as if I could outrun the life I had just dismantled. The truth was, I needed to stand still for a while, to figure out what came next. I checked into a modest hotel under a name the agency had prearranged. No one from the press knew where I was. Most didn't even have a clear photo of me, just courtroom sketches and third-hand descriptions. The media had seized on the story like vultures, of course. Double life. Wife turned agent. Honey trap. The usual garbage. I didn't read the headlines. I didn't watch the news. I went quiet. Really quiet. The kind of silence that doesn't serve a purpose, that doesn't hide anything or wait for anything, just silence for its own sake. I ordered room service. I walked through nearby parks with a scarf over my head. I stood in front of a mirror one evening for 40 minutes and tried to see myself. Not Agent Emily Clark, not Mrs. Mark Clark, just me. It took time, and still, I'm not sure I fully managed it. Because when you live undercover long enough, the mask stops being something you wear. It fuses with your face. You begin to doubt the edges of your own identity. You start to wonder whether you were ever more than a role you played exceptionally well. That's the price they never put in the paperwork. Not the danger, not the isolation, the disappearance. Even now, I don't know what parts of my quietness were tactical and which were real. Did I smile because I needed to, or because I didn't know what else to do? Did I hide behind Mark because the mission demanded it, or because I found a strange kind of comfort in invisibility? There's no debrief for that. The agency offered me leave, a long one, full support. They were beyond satisfied with the outcome. The materials I'd collected had blown open a cluster of corrupt intermediaries, one of which reached deep into a foreign intelligence operation we'd been tracking for over a decade. They said I had done exceptional work. They said I had exceeded the requirements of the assignment. But they didn't ask if I was okay. That wasn't their job, and I didn't ask for it. I gave them the post-mission report. I returned the credentials. I handed over the last encrypted drive I'd hidden in a vent beneath our former kitchen sink. A final layer of security, just in case. Then I left. Not back to D.C., not to any place that knew me. I went west, a quiet town outside Flagstaff, cold in the mornings, warm by noon. I rented a small house with a porch that creaked and a backyard full of juniper. I told the landlord I was a freelance researcher. She nodded and didn't ask questions. People out here understood that sometimes quiet wasn't just a mood, it was a choice. For a month, I said nothing to anyone beyond the bare minimum. Then one afternoon, I walked into the local library and signed up for a card. That was the first step. I wasn't trying to disappear. I was trying to appear, finally, fully, as someone who wasn't pretending anymore. The sentencing was broadcast nationally. I didn't watch it live, but I read the transcript later. 30 years, no possibility of parole for the first 20. The judge had been unflinching. She referenced not just the crimes, but the betrayal of professional and personal trust, so complete, so calculated, that it constitutes a national and emotional fraud of the highest order. That stuck with me. Not just national fraud, emotional fraud. I hadn't heard that phrase before, but it made sense. What Mark had done wasn't just legal treason, it was personal treason. To everyone who trusted him, believed in him, and in a way to me, not because I loved him, but because I trusted the mask long enough to believe it was worth tracking. Some part of me still mourned the version of him I invented, the husband he never was, the man he pretended to be. We had once stood in front of a priest and exchanged vows, even if I knew mine were lines from a script. But he didn't, and that's what made it real. Not for love, but for deception. Because while I wore a cover to fulfill my duty, he wore one to conceal his betrayal. We were both undercover, but only one of us walked out clean. Sometimes I wonder what people think when they hear the story now. Do they picture me as cold, ruthless? Do they imagine me planting microphones in flowers, recording pillow talk, wearing a wire under silk? Maybe. Or maybe they imagine a hero, a patriot. someone who sacrificed a life for a mission. They're all wrong. The truth is less cinematic. I was a woman who listened when no one else did, who stayed quiet long enough to hear the truth echo through the cracks, who used silence not as a shield, but as a scalpel. There's no medal for that. There's just the knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous place to hide is inside a lie called marriage, and that sometimes the sharpest weapon is the one that never raises its voice. Epilogue. Last week, a letter arrived at the Flagstaff post office. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. The handwriting was unmistakable. It simply read, "You were always better at the long game. No signature. No plea. Just that." I burned it in the fireplace, because I already knew, and I've stopped playing.